To my right, we have Thomas Robinson of Domino Data Lab, singular, not labs. Doug Filippone of Snowpoint and Palantir fame. And at the end, we have Congressman Ro Khanna. Thank you guys for being here today.
Thank you.
We have about 35 minutes. I want to save some time for audience Q&A as well. So if you're game, let's just hop right in. Fantastic. T-Rob.
Yeah.
Much has been said about dealing with the Pentagon as a customer, so we should pile on there. What are some of the biggest hurdles you and your friends are dealing with, and then what are the fixes or the advice you would give?
Yeah. So I feel like I've gotten to relive this through every panel discussion today. For context, we're a startup who's done work in the commercial sector for many years, and about 2.5 years ago decided we were going to invest in building a capability to serve the Defense Department. And it's been an interesting 2.5 years since then. I would say the fantastic success we've had, DIU has been lovely and wonderful and great to work with, and a fantastic guide for us as we went through some of our initial deployment and testing of our technology with the Navy. And that's sort of propelled us to a point where we're now in sort of the second phase of the Valley of Death, awaiting a production contract and awaiting, being part of a POM down the road. And I would say, man, that's the rough part. And so everything that everybody says here today, I'm living it. And so take it from me, it's a tough spot to be in. I was thinking about, how to really help, and I think everybody's sort of made the point that the Defense Department needs to change. I won't reiterate all of the procurement stuff, but maybe one thought that's a little bit different. If we take the model of something like Y Combinator, who helps college graduates figure out how the hell to start a business, maybe an incubator that would help startups like ours figure out how to go through the later stage of the process. So pick up after the good work of DIU and help sort of explain the acronyms, get through clearance process, help with dealing with procurement, and really help put that together. I think that'd be interesting and helpful.
Thank you. Doug, you've been at this for a long time, including almost 2 decades at Palantir. How has the military AI and autonomy space evolved over those, I think, 17 years? And what is that next big leap?
We have some time. Yeah, no, I think it's been a fascinating journey, just sort of seeing. I've been through several, you call it waves of AI. When I started, the interesting thing is, when I studied at West Point a million years ago, but I actually, in mathematics, I studied optimization, which was, at the time, we wrote algorithms. A lot of it sounds very similar to, what we're doing now. So it's been interesting to see certain, like even in 2008, there was like these things called entity extractors, which was like, you're not going to read reports, there's too much information, we'll have computers do this. None of it worked. Everyone was obsessed with it. We couldn't even get into market without saying that as an engineering approach, we knew it didn't work, but the government wanted it so bad, you couldn't say that. And so you're like, well, if you believe in these things, we'll have a grayed out button and you can insert your favorite entity extractor of choice. And then there was probably around 2015 or so, it's sort of the second wave, the early computer vision stuff, early days of Maven. And then now you sort of have this, autonomy, large language models. It's fascinating to see. And like my bar is, what I believed in when I used to run the defense thing for Palantir was always like, I worry about the technology is not ready for prime time. I worried about a reputation, like I don't want to be part of a failure ever. And so how can we give like a platform approach to give the AI time to mature? That was kind of our initial approach, and then it actually eventually started to work. But now as an investor, so I've, with Snowpoint, been there for, the firm's about 4 years old. We've done 13 or so investments. And thinking about like the general bar with AI is, does it actually work at all? It's like the first bar, which is actually a pretty high bar. A lot of it just doesn't work. And then the second bar is it actually useful at all? And then there's that Venn diagram of it works and it's useful. Incredibly few companies do that. And so when I look at that, there's two main parts and I'll shut up. But autonomy in the military context, and then sort of decision making and accelerating workflows are really big spaces that I'm very interested in as an investor, and we can talk more about that later. But that's where I've seen it now. But there's finally real use cases and real companies that are doing work.
Congressman, you're on the China committee. What's the best word to describe the AI competition between Washington and Beijing, and who's ahead if it can be distilled that simply?
I think Reagan said, "We win, they lose." I mean, that needs to be the mantra of our approach. We need to make sure that we are continuing to invest in compute power that is both private and in places that is public. We need to make sure that we have an understanding of the value also of open source. I mean, I think one of the things DeepSeek showed is that you can have a small team that can innovate if they have open source models, and we have to be understanding that innovation needs to be taking place here in the United States. We need to make sure that we're applying it faster with our military and applying it in ways for our businesses faster than China is. We need to, I saw Arun Kumar here in his project, and we need to make sure that we're attracting the best and brightest in terms of AI and technology into government. And that, despite the spectacle they saw last night, that the American people still think government service is worthwhile. And I'm not talking about partisan spectacle, I just am saying, people on both sides looked at that and they said, how are we paying our politicians to do that? What are we going to do to attract people still to government?
Thank you. I definitely want to open up the conversation to the group, but I also want to stick to DeepSeek here since you brought it up. Their breakout earlier this year stunned a lot of players, including in the national security world. What do y'all think their accomplishments mean for us here stateside? And what's the proper counterattack? That might be a bit of an aggressive word, but what's the right move on the U.S.'s part?
Want me to start?
Please.
I think my take is that the development of models like that is far less important than the application of the models. And at the end of the day, a model that can be put into a chat app, that's a very easy deployment relative to a model that's being used to make critical decisions in the hands of a warfighter or in a pharmaceutical company or in a financial services regime. And so it's interesting. It's open source. It's continued development. We're going to do more of that. There's going to be many more. I think the actual sort of number of models or amount of that is far less relevant than being able to go and apply those models as in a trustworthy and fast context.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. If I can be contrarian for a second, it's easy to just be the China fear. You can just preach that, and then you're like, it becomes like a budget game. You're like, we're scared of China. Give me more money. My sense is like, look, it was a Chinese hedge fund who leaked the report. They're pitching their own book. And then you're like, okay, well, what do we really know? It's classic China. You don't know anything. You know that there's actually an LLM that works. That is true. But the whole idea of these transformative models is that they're playing off each other. Each one gets easier and better. But I often, when I talk to my investors about this, where it's like, hey, are you going to invest in Anthropic? Are you going to invest in the third one? At some point, all of this is going to be commoditized. So if you're thinking from an investor lens, you're not going to make money on this. There's one or two of these things that are going to make a massive amount of money, and the rest of it's going to be free. Not that you're necessarily investors, but that's something you have to think about. And where people are going to make the most money in the utility is going to be at the application and platform level. And so that's like, that's the Microsofts, that's the Palantirs. There's a bunch of companies who actually have platforms that you can really revolutionize your workflows and do something useful. And so it goes back to my earlier point of like, okay, they have an LLM. Okay, then what? It sort of asks the next question. So take that with a grain of salt, but I think it's important.
I would say, do you think we'd be having the same conversation or the same concern if it emerged out of a different country? And I think you were hitting on that.
Yeah, you'd be like, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I don't know,
Congressman?
You think I'm totally wrong?
Look, I think we have to look at what effective export controls actually could be. I mean, the reality is they got a lot of the semiconductors, and even though we have these export controls, what companies have been doing is saying, okay, they won't sell version 100, they'll sell version 99 to get around them. So the actual control where we can have, I think, is with ASML, with some of the critical minerals in Japan, the component parts that China would need to build semiconductors. But even there, we need to recognize that they're probably going to catch up, and we have to stay ahead on the innovation and the application of AI, and that's really what is going to fuel the United States lead. So I would try to block as much as of the ingredients that it takes to make these advanced chips, while making sure that we have the most innovative environment here.
And to stay on that, how are y'all thinking through supply chain security, and especially in light of like this panel's title, digital security? I'm always really curious about if and how a China or an Iran would sneak into the system and poison maybe training data for computer vision, or maybe your stockpile numbers or something like that. How are you guys thinking through supply chain, both physical, the amount of ammo you might have, and then the digital backbone of that as well?
Well, I mean, it's a little bit started with California or Silicon Valley waking up, in the sense of like, don't give all of your IP to China. Like I'd be like, that was a pretty dumb move that I think it was fueled by greed. This is mostly a couple years old, where there's still like a little bit of a hangover in that, but it was like literally at all costs give China everything. And I think certainly in my field, that's not a problem. I go to these briefings, by the government, where they're like, we don't take money from China. And I'm like, yeah, okay, I got that. It's just that, there's like very normal things everybody in this room would know to be the way that you rule your life. But I think that there was a lot of people just willing to make money at any cost that were willing to give everything to China.
Either of you two have anything to add?
I think one of the things with DeepSeek is how do you have better protection of ChatGPT or at Microsoft? I mean, where we have to look at whether they ask those apps questions that weren't flagged that allowed them to understand the reverse engineering, and what are the types of standards that can be put, and how are they going to be enforced. I mean, I'm not sure how they got it, but we should certainly have an investigation of how that took place. And then we need the government to step up. I mean, my view is that our cybersecurity, because of a lot of the work that has been done, is quite strong when it comes to our most sensitive defense and our most sensitive military technology, but we don't have the same, obviously, standards throughout the government, nor do we have the same standards in the private sector. So you look at someone like General Hoff, who I have a tremendous admiration for, with Cyber Command and TSA. How can he help with the private sector lead on getting better standards in the private sector and getting better standards throughout the government?
So,
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Doug.
Well, sorry, just to add on, I mean, there's definitely like hacking and cyber. It's like a totally different field that is important. There's always going to be hacks. There's always going to be problems in that capacity. I mean, I think this crowd knows this, but I mean, obviously, if they're hacking SIPR to get on these networks, then we have a much bigger problem. That's one thing to say. But then also, like, if you think of the fundamental rules around AI in general, or like if you're going to use AI both in the commercial sector and in the government, you have to think about understanding the models. And like you mentioned, like, could they modify the training data sets and screw that up so then it's like garbage in, garbage out? One of the things that I always believed in terms of the efficacy, if you're selling these things to decision makers, is some companies use this thing where they have, like, call it a black box approach. Like, we have AI, it's so amazing, it's proprietary, it's in this black box, you don't need to know about it, pay a lot of money, you press the button, and it gives the answer. That is BS, right? And so you just have to like think about it in the sense, you can't even sell that too. It's like that ship has sailed too. But there's this idea, I call it the glass box, but it's like you really have to understand what is the algorithm doing? And so you can understand, this is really important from an ethics perspective and really understanding the process of your decision in your organization, because this is tailored, mostly all of the best companies will be dual purpose in this capacity. So you're gonna have to, whether it's Tyson's, chicken or it's the, Department of the Navy, you wanna be able to say, this problem is important, what is the data going in? You understand how it flows through the algorithms, and then you understand the output in a way that is auditable, so you can understand how we got there. And then you codify those rules, you organizationally, and you move on. But if you can't audit it, your organization, it leaves you susceptible to all the problems you just talked about.
You were about to say something.
We're still really early with LLMs in particular, with respect to how guardrails are going to work. And I think the technology for validating and testing is just not even there yet. I mean, the technology's only been on the scene for a couple of years, and LLMs in particular have hallucination issues, which I think go even deeper than potentially being poisoned or mistrained. So,
On this point of black box versus glass box, I believe, the GAO has said repeatedly, one of the biggest hurdles with adoption here is
I just made that up, by the way. I don't know that that's a term.
that's
So,
catchy.
yeah.
Is fostering this trust between man and machine, especially when you're getting shot at, or you're getting jammed, or when you're getting bombed, right? So T-Rob, what's the winning recipe there? How do you foster that trust? How, in your case specifically, why would a sailor trust your counter mine software?
yeah. So I think just to sort of set the context of how we think about this philosophically is you're absolutely right. Trust has to be built into the system, and trust has to be driven by the requirements of the warfighter, because any model that isn't working as intended is gonna lose faith and not be able to be used on an ongoing basis. And what's worse is when you have the human in the loop who lets the machine just go ahead and do what they want. And so that trust also has to be applied when the humans are sort of asleep at the wheel, if you will. So the way that we think about it is bringing a lot of the same fundamental governance technology that's used in the private sector. So we work with a lot of large pharmaceutical companies, financial services companies, insurance companies. They all have risk based in the models that are running and operating their business. Granted, it's more financial than existential, but those models have to be built first with a use case, a clear definition, have to be engineered, validated, deployed, monitored, tested on an ongoing basis, and most importantly, rebuilt and re-engineered as the world changes, the theater changes, whatever that might be. And so we see building trust in models as largely a process issue that needs to happen alongside being able to deliver models rapidly and do it in a trustworthy way based on all that goes into it. And this is my point before, the application is much harder than the technology itself. It is very easy to take any given model in one particular problem domain, but to build a trusted system is much more challenging.
And Doug, how are you thinking about this when you're investing or picking a company to kind of follow up with?
Well, I mean, the biggest thing ends up being, you get pitched, I don't know, 10 companies a week, it seems like, where they're like, we have some AI stuff, it's so amazing, we're going to change the world.
Being a reporter.
Yeah, and then you're like,
Same
yeah,
pitches.
exactly, it's going to be so great, write the pitch on this. The challenge is like, you can do a lot of stuff in a lab, you can, you have a curated data set, you're like, this will save you X number of dollars, this is, it'll cure cancer, it'll do this and that. And then you're like, dude, I don't know, have you put it in the real world? Because it just changes everything. And, then you get to this point of like, okay, well, how are you getting your data, how are you integrating your data to feed your algorithms? Has it actually trained on the whole world or the applicable mini world of data so that it's useful? And you just start to like filter out, like getting to the final part of like, I trust this, is just getting to what works. Then you sort of build like, okay, now I know that it works, it's in the real world, and then building in all the trust vacuums. But it's because civil liberties and like understanding the decisions that are being made, these are very complicated and important things of like, how do you apply this? where is a human really necessary? What do you feel comfortable with as an organization? Where you're going to automate? How fast are you skipping steps? But then you get to the government person or the commercial person. It's like, all right, I want a human to make this decision. But you serve that up quicker.
Congressman, what are the conversations like in Congress about this issue of trust? Or what are you hearing from the armed services, the leadership there about this debate back and forth?
Well, I think AI, as we looked at as a tool for augmentation of human capability, not for the displacement of human judgment. And Secretary Esper, actually, in the first Trump administration, had articulated basic principles of the use of AI at the Department of Defense, that key decision-making had to be made by human beings, that you could never substitute for that kind of judgment, but that AI would be used to augment human capability. And we need to continue to refine those principles as more and more AI is adopted, certainly in the military, but throughout government or throughout the private sector.
So to the point of augmenting humans, Ukraine has been battling back Russia's invasion, renewed invasion for the past 3 years. I would love to get y'all's take on the one big headline, right, or takeaway that has come from that war. And do you think the autonomous weapons kind of Pandora's box has been opened in Eastern Europe?
I guess I take lead on that if you don't mind.
Please.
You know, it's interesting. So in the very beginning of the war, I went to Kyiv. I was like, I have to see this myself. I really want to understand. Obviously, I spent a few years in the military back in the day. But I just wanted to understand the problem. And I think for the first time in our kind of generation, we saw this idea of the idea of the near peer or whatever. So now you're working in GPS jamming environments, electronic warfare. We have a lot of exquisite systems that don't work in that. Like they brief really well, they're great, they're the most precise weapons in all of mankind, and then they just don't work anymore. And so that presented, kind of a real engineering challenge that I think at least certainly a lot of my companies have been dealing with, of like how do you solve this electronic warfare, not that people haven't known about electronic warfare, I just think that we talked about it and didn't solve it. But really understanding like what does autonomy mean? It's sort of a buzzwords of sort where you're like, well, I saw this dancing dragon, and it's so cool. And it's like that's actually not autonomy at all. That's like choreography, where you're like navigating to known waypoints. You're just like you're a concert person. But in the real world, it's like, hey, if I lose all connectivity, period, does my system still understand how to perceive the real world? Whether it's through existing systems of LiDAR, radar, can you use dead reckoning, inertial systems to operate without GPS? Can you communicate inside? And then you have to have like software that fuses it all together. So you have all these different sensing things that are fused together, and then you're going to start making your decisions. So this idea of autonomy is like it's a nested function it's much more complicated than a lot of people. They talk about the first order thing. Oh, we have some automation, like the little robot that sweeps the floors or whatever. It's way more complicated when the Russians are jamming it.
Takeaway?
Bringing the commercial builders of technology close to the warfighter, it should not take a crisis of that magnitude to reinforce that lesson. And so there's an opportunity to reflect that in how we operate in the U.S., while also not having to be in a regime that doesn't rely on a large industrial base. So we can do things in a better way, but bringing that learning to the forefront is critical.
What's your insight,
I
Congressman?
think it was a wake-up call for many people in Congress that modern warfare has changed. And, you had books like Kill Chain and others that people had read academically. You had conversation about this going on for 10, 15 years. But as often the case in American politics, it takes some kind of seminal event, sometimes catastrophic like 9/11, or sometimes something overseas that sort of wakes people up and says, okay, we've got to make a change. And I think now you have the Armed Services Committee at least recognizing that. I mean, Chairman Rogers, to his credit, had a field hearing in Silicon Valley for the first time to signal that things have to be different. Now, I personally am a fan of Michael Bloomberg's proposal, at least to take a serious look, that 15% of the Pentagon budget should be set aside for advanced and emerging technology to force the kind of change in looking at modern strategy. And at a time where the defense budget is for the first time up into total debate. I mean, you've got Hegseth talking about 8% cuts. You got Trump talking about agreeing with Putin and Xi Jinping to 50% cuts. And you have the Republicans saying we want to add $100 billion. But the point is, it's all up for debate. We should certainly use this moment to emphasize emerging technology and more of a commitment to the procurement, not just to the DIU part of the funding initially, but to the procurement of it.
On that last bit, where are you seeing the AI and autonomy winners and losers in the DoD, and are those winners getting enough support / what would you want to give them?
I think there's obviously a consensus amongst, at least on the Armed Services Committee and many people in DoD, that the Pacific has to be a major focus, and resources have to be put towards what it will take to maintain naval superiority in the Pacific, to maintain total and complete deterrence to China's invasion with Taiwan, when they're tightening the noose every week, and that we need to have a effective strategy to that, and autonomy in the sea, autonomy in terms of drones that are low cost and high volume are going to be a key part of that. I would just say, from a public perspective, that there's been an effective focus on that, and I think where we have to really make sure that we succeed is the execution of it with enough procurement of what we need.
Yeah, I think, well, there's actually earlier, I tried to get a question in, this maybe was the first question, the board of the day or something like that, but there's an interesting perception here of, one of the ladies asked a question where she was like, hey, what if Palantir and Anduril and a couple of the other big ones are like going to suck all the oxygen out and they're going to win all of it, or whatever. And the point that I wanted to make is, even though those companies are great and they're all doing well, they get a lot of press, et cetera, even Palantir, which is obviously public and in the S&P 500, et cetera, they're not even in the top 100 defense contractors. Like, literally say that again, they're not even in the top 100 defense contractors. It's kind of crazy when you think about it, as much as you see Palantir in the news or Anduril in the news, and Anduril's even 10 times smaller, right? And so it's like, we're nowhere. So to the extent that we're talking about innovation budgets and getting started, like, we just got started. I mean, there's so much low-hanging fruit, for sure.
And so all of y'all have your fingers on the pulse of Silicon Valley, and I definitely wanted to ask this. Could we get a vibe check? What's the rumors? What's the chatter? What's the concern? Vibe check. T-Rob?
I mean, one thing that strikes me just personally is what a time to be in Silicon Valley when there's been a massive cultural shift from no way we're thinking about defending America to, hey, let's get in the fight, and let's build technology. I mean, I've been in Domino 9 years. It is just a palpable difference between even a few years ago, and I don't know exactly what's motivated that. Maybe some of these sort of massive overseas threats, but I think it's a fantastic time. It's an exciting time.
Doug?
Yeah, no, look, I lived through the time when half of the Valley or all of the Valley would rather partner with China than the U.S. government. It's crazy, by the way, totally crazy. I remember being sent out of Washington to D.C. to make sure that Amazon wasn't going to turn off our cloud service because we worked with the government. It was wild. Thank God that has shifted. Now, you see a mini wave of sorts of entrepreneurs and young kids that are like really excited to work for the government and help out. No, I mean, part of it is like, they talk about in recruiting for just being in the military at all. It's like, first you have to be just proud of your country, and that's like, you're seeing that a little bit. And then, is it a viable work? Defense has always had the coolest problems. But it was like, hey, are they open to working with you at all? Like you could show up, you're living in this, but it's like, you're going to sacrifice your own life, all your money likely to start a company, and then you're going to go build something cool and show it to the government, and they're like, go screw yourself. It's like, that's like, very, it's
Again,
depressing.
We think, yeah, you.
Yeah, but there's been a lot of sea change. It doesn't mean that there's not a lot of change, the change that still needs to happen. But it's like you see the military leadership and the civilians are all on board with, they want innovation, they want change. You have a new breed of entrepreneurs that want to help. There'll be some compression with the primes where they'll be forced to innovate. I don't think it's a zero-sum game there. I do think that they can win together, and I hope that that's the case. The administration seems to really be backing this, so it's kind of an exciting time from that perspective for sure.
What are you hearing?
Well, just to your point about the primes and new entrants, I mean, the B-21, I think, is an example where the subcomponents were bid out, and you didn't have, unlike the F-35, which everything went to Lockheed, the same cost overruns and problems. So I think there has to be a recognition, even if some of the contracts are going to the primes, that you need the subcomponents to be going to other companies. You need far more competition, and that's going to make us more innovative. I mean, look, in Silicon Valley, whether you like it or not, and I obviously represent the place, it is incredibly consequential. When I got to Congress in 2016, people thought, oh, those are kind of tech issues. And now they see, my district has $14 trillion of market value. It's been accounted for 90% of the stock market's gains. Whether you like the fact that your kids are addicted to their phones or you bemoan that fact, the fact is it's shaping so much of our culture. And now we're realizing that if you want to be the leading military of the world, you have to have the leading technology. And so I think the biggest shift has been that Americans now see that it is a huge fountain of power, economic, cultural, military power. And in my view, the challenge is how we do that consistent with American values, humanistic values, and we can debate about what those are, but that is going to be the challenge. And how do we shape this in a way that is in the country's interest and in every region's interest?
Thank you. So we have 3-ish minutes left. If anyone in the audience has a question, please raise your hand. There's mics around here somewhere. And if not, I have more questions. Okay. Oh, in the back right.
I'm Jacob Dunn, Naval Research Lab. I was wondering if you see any inherent limitations to technology, specifically in the AI space, just because of, I'll say, morality of warfare and policy that we would necessarily impose on it as a free society. You can imagine trigger authority, human in the loop, and the like.
Do you want to take it?
Yeah, I mean, no, I mean, in the field, I don't see that as limitation. I feel like it's a cost of doing business. Like you have to be able to make AI that can work within an ethical framework, period. I don't think anybody is, trying to have killer robots that are just running around by themselves. Yeah, and we're just not at that maturity level anyway. I feel like people who get into the space and they're building AI around those problem sets, they think, I'm not speaking for all of them, but anyone that would be investable would think they have to have thought through those problems and work in that ethical environment.
I agree with that.
Any other questions? Okay, I'll ask one. Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead. Got too excited.
So in talking about AI, everyone ends up talking about the tech or policy, but they overlook talent. And it feels like for this ecosystem to really blossom, getting top AI talent, et cetera, into government is incredibly important. because it facilitates then some of the interactions with knowing how to interact with the private sector folks. I run a foundation. We have a $500 million endowment. Our mission is how do we inspire this next generation of top tech talent to go into government. It takes both parties. It takes government wanting to have placements of people that may come in for 2 or 3 years. Government sells careers, students are buying experiences, right? So one, how do we accept that as a new realm of recruiting? And the second is from the private sector side, wanting this talent, once they've been in government, to want to come out and work in your kind of companies. Because that's, I think, the spiral that we need to have. Like, we think of revolving door in a disparaging way, but in technology, I think it's essential that it's fusion. And we need more of that. So I'd be interested in your thoughts around how we kind of create more of this ecosystem from a talent perspective.
Well, look, I mean, that's certainly what I'm trying to do. So amen. You know, like, I'm like, amen, brother. No, I think that, like, look, there is a certain amount of expertise that you have to have. You know, I think about, like, in my personal journey, it was like, okay, I studied mathematics in college, and then I was a commander for 17 years, and I went to war, and then I, you know, started at the very beginning at the bottom of a software company. And I had to understand the problem sets. It sort of drove me from the very beginning of just like, oh, hey, I was a commander. I know what the hell is important. And then guiding the company, but having the technical background to talk to an engineer to be like, all right, we need to make the right products that actually matter so that we have a business. You know, and so I do think that, like, the revolving door in that capacity is super important. That's a really pejorative term, as you mentioned. But it's like you have to have that experience in technology so that you're focusing on the right problems.
I think, you know, Aaron, the work you've been doing, I mean, the book you wrote, and the foundation you've set up, and Victoria's help in the partnerships, I think it's fantastic. I mean, we need people realizing that public service is important. I mean, this country has been blessed that at the times of crisis, we've had the best and brightest come into government. And that's becoming harder and harder, and so I think you can help bridge that gap. Now, when I asked the general, the head of Cyber Command and NSA, I said, why? How do you attract folks? You know, young folks, they want to go become part of the Marines, and they want to go do exciting missions. How do you get them to be part of what you're doing? And he said, well, we have one advantage. We can go to places that most other people aren't authorized to do, and we get so many of really cool missions. So I think it's partly explaining how consequential and fun and dynamic being in the government can be, and how rewarding that can then be afterwards in people's careers, not in an unethical way, not that they're cashing in on their government connections, but in a way that they're leveraging that expertise and experience.
So, Congressman, you got the last word as we are out of time. Thank you guys for your remarks, and thank you guys for tuning in.